You're doing something right now that scientists say is too small to matter, but it might be quietly changing your brain, your body, and even how fast you age. It's called humming. And the strange part is we still don't fully understand why it works. Let's begin with something so simple that it almost feels too small to matter. Close your mouth and hum. No melody, no performance, just a steady, quiet vibration. It's the kind of thing people do absent-mindedly, like tapping a finger on a table. Because it feels so ordinary, we tend to assume nothing important is happening. But that assumption is misleading. Humming is not just a sound. It's a physical event. When you hum, your vocal cords begin to vibrate. Air from your lungs is pushed upward, but instead of escaping freely through your mouth, it's partially trapped. That trapped air builds pressure and is forced through narrow passages in your throat and nasal cavity. The result is a stable, continuous vibration. Now imagine tapping the surface of a still pond. The ripples spread outward in smooth circular waves. Something very similar is happening inside your body. The vibration you create doesn't stay confined to your throat. It propagates through your tissues, your bones, and the air-filled spaces in your skull. Your head, in a sense, becomes a resonance chamber. This is where the idea becomes more interesting. A resonance chamber is not just a container, it shapes and amplifies vibrations. Musical instruments rely on this principle. A guitar string on its own is quiet, but when attached to a hollow wooden body, the sound becomes richer and louder. The structure changes the behavior of the vibrations. Your skull and sinuses function in a comparable way. They don't just passively transmit the hum, they modify it. Certain frequencies get amplified, others dampened. The geometry of your face, the density of your bones, even the amount of air in your sinuses all influence the final pattern of vibration. So humming is not a single, simple action. It's a complex interaction between airflow, tissue, and structure. Now consider something slightly less obvious. Vibrations are not limited to what you can hear. The same physical motion that produces sound also produces mechanical movement at a microscopic level. Cells experience tiny shifts. Fluids move differently. Pressure changes occur in subtle but measurable ways. If you've ever stood next to a large speaker and felt the bass in your chest, you already know this intuitively. Sound is not just heard, it's felt. Humming is a much quieter version of that same phenomenon, but it happens from the inside out. There's also a stability to humming that makes it unique. Unlike speaking, where sounds constantly change, humming tends to be steady and continuous. That steadiness matters. In physics, systems often respond more strongly to consistent, repeating inputs than to irregular ones. A steady push, applied over time, can produce larger effects than a series of random forces. So what looks like a trivial act, just making a soft sound, turns out to be a controlled way of introducing rhythmic, structured vibration into your body. At this point, we haven't said anything about brains, aging, or health. We're just describing what is physically happening. But even at this basic level, something becomes clear. Humming is not nothing. It is a way of interacting with your own body using one of the most fundamental phenomena in physics, vibration. And once you see it that way, the natural question is no longer, why would humming matter? The better question is, given that your body is built to respond to physical signals, why wouldn't it? Now shift your attention from sound to something less visible, but far more influential. Your nervous system. Inside your body is an enormous communication network. Not metaphorically, literally. It's a system of electrical signaling pathways that constantly carry information between your brain and the rest of your body. Every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle shift in digestion is being regulated through this network. One of the most important components of this system is the vagus nerve. It's a long, wandering nerve that runs from the base of your brain down through your neck and into your chest and abdomen, connecting to major organs along the way. If you imagine your brain as a control center, the vagus nerve is one of its main communication lines, sending signals back and forth continuously. What makes this nerve especially interesting is that it doesn't just send commands outward. A large portion of its fibers carry information from the body back to the brain. In other words, your internal organs are constantly reporting their state. Now introduce humming into this system. When you hum, vibrations we talked about earlier don't just exist in empty space. They interact with tissues that are connected to nerves. The throat, the larynx, the chest cavity. These are not isolated structures. They are embedded within this communication network. Think of the system like a set of tightly stretched strings on a musical instrument. If one part vibrates, nearby parts can begin to vibrate as well, even if you didn't directly touch them. This is resonance again, but now applied to biological structures. There's evidence suggesting that the kind of low-frequency, steady vibration produced by humming can influence the vagus nerve. Not in a dramatic, switch-flipping way, but more like a gentle nudge. A shift in the overall tone of the system. To understand why that matters, consider how your body operates under different conditions. When you're under stress, your system shifts into a mode often described as fight or flight. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, digestion slows down. This is useful in short bursts, but harmful if it persists. There's another mode, sometimes called rest and repair, where the body does the opposite. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, and energy is directed toward maintenance and recovery. The vagus nerve plays a major role in regulating this balance. So the idea is not that humming activates something entirely new, but that it may bias the system toward one mode over the other. The steady vibration, combined with slower, more controlled breathing, creates conditions that the nervous system tends to interpret as safe and stable. Here's a useful way to picture it. Imagine you're holding a cup of muddy water. If you keep shaking it, the particles remain suspended and the water stays cloudy. But if you set it down and stop disturbing it, the particles gradually settle and the water becomes clear. Humming might be doing something similar, not by directly cleaning the system, but by reducing the internal noise that keeps everything unsettled. But we have to be careful here. The body is not a simple machine where one input produces one predictable output. The same vibration might have slightly different effects depending on the person, their current state, and even their expectations. And while there are measurable changes, like slight shifts in heart rate or breathing patterns, it's much harder to trace a direct line from those changes to larger claims about long-term health or brain restructuring. So at this stage, the most honest statement is this. Humming appears to interact with the nervous system in subtle, measurable ways, likely through pathways involving structures like the vagus nerve. These interactions can influence the overall state of the body, especially in terms of relaxation and regulation. But the system is complex, and we are only observing the surface of what is actually happening underneath. Now let's move from mechanism to measurement. It's one thing to describe what might be happening. It's another to ask what we can actually observe, quantify, and test. Start with something surprisingly concrete. The gas called nitric oxide. This molecule is produced naturally in your body and plays several important roles. It helps regulate blood flow by relaxing blood vessels, participates in immune responses, and acts as a signaling molecule between cells. In other words, it's small, but it's involved in a wide range of processes. Now here's the interesting part. When you hum, airflow through your nasal passages changes in a very specific way. Because your mouth is closed, air is redirected through narrow sinus channels. The vibration adds a kind of oscillating pressure to that airflow. If you think of your sinuses as a set of tiny connected caves, humming is like pushing air in and out of them rhythmically. This movement appears to dramatically increase the release of nitric oxide into those spaces. In controlled measurements, the increase is not subtle. It can be many times higher than during quiet breathing. What does that mean? Locally, in the nasal passages, higher nitric oxide levels may help improve airflow and reduce the growth of certain pathogens. More broadly, since nitric oxide influences blood vessel dilation, it could affect how efficiently oxygen and nutrients are delivered to tissues. But notice the gap. We can measure nitric oxide levels. We can observe that they change during humming. What's harder is tracing how a short-term increase translates into long-term biological outcomes. This is a recurring theme. Now consider another measurable effect. Shifts in breathing patterns. Humming naturally slows down your breath. You can't hum rapidly and irregularly. The act itself imposes a rhythm. In many cases, the exhalation becomes longer than the inhalation, which is known to influence the balance of the autonomic nervous system. Again, this is measurable. You can track breathing rate, heart rate variability, even subtle changes in blood pressure. And often, during or after humming, these indicators move in the direction associated with a calmer physiological state. There are also attempts to look directly at the brain. Using tools like EEG or functional imaging, researchers have examined how vocalization, including humming, affects brain activity. Some patterns suggest increased synchronization between different regions, particularly those involved in attention and emotional regulation. But this is where interpretation becomes difficult. The brain is always active. It is never off, and it rarely behaves in a simple, repeatable way. If you observe a change in brainwaves during humming, you still have to ask, is that change caused by the vibration, the breathing, the focus of attention, or some combination of all three? It's like trying to determine which ingredient in a complex recipe is responsible for the final taste. Another complication is variability between individuals. One person might experience a noticeable calming effect. Another might feel almost nothing. These differences are not noise to be ignored. They are part of the phenomenon itself. Human physiology is not standardized. So what do we actually have at the end of this? We have a set of observations. Humming changes airflow and increases nitric oxide in the sinuses. It imposes a slower, more regular breathing pattern. It is associated with shifts in measurable indicators of nervous system activity. It may correlate with changes in brain dynamics. Each of these is real, but each is also limited. None of them, on their own, justify sweeping conclusions about dramatic brain rewiring or reversing biological aging. They are pieces of a puzzle, not the finished picture. And that's an uncomfortable position, because the human mind prefers clear answers. We want a simple statement: it works or it doesn't. But in systems as complex as the human body, clarity often gives way to nuance. What we're seeing with humming is not a single powerful effect, but a collection of small interacting influences, each measurable, each incomplete, and all still being explored. Now we come to the boldest part of the claim, that humming can reverse aging. To understand why this is such a difficult statement, you first have to ask a more basic question. What exactly is aging? It's tempting to think of aging as a single process, like a clock ticking forward. But that picture is misleading. Aging is not one mechanism. It's a collection of many different processes happening at different scales. At the microscopic level, DNA accumulates damage over time. Cells divide, and each division introduces small errors. Proteins fold incorrectly or degrade. Waste products build up. Structures inside the cell, like mitochondria, become less efficient. At a larger scale, tissues lose elasticity. Organs gradually become less effective at maintaining stability. In the brain, connections between neurons can weaken or change in ways that affect memory and cognition. So when someone says reverse aging, they are making a claim about all of these processes at once. That's an extraordinarily high bar. Now place humming into this picture. We've already discussed that humming can influence breathing, introduce vibration into tissues, and slightly shift the balance of the nervous system. These are real effects, but they operate at a very different level than the fundamental drivers of aging. To see the mismatch, consider an analogy. Imagine you have an old building. Over time, the structure develops cracks, the wiring degrades, and the materials weaken. Now suppose you improve the ventilation and reduce the noise inside the building. That might make the environment more comfortable. It might even slow down some forms of wear. But it does not rebuild the structure from the ground up. In the same way, humming may create conditions that are supportive of better physiological function. For example, by reducing chronic stress, it could lower the long-term strain on certain systems. Since prolonged stress is associated with faster biological aging, reducing it could, in principle, slow some aspects of decline, but slowing down is not the same as reversing. There is also a subtle psychological step that often goes unnoticed. People observe a genuine benefit, feeling calmer, breathing more easily, sleeping slightly better, and then extend that benefit into a much larger claim. This is a common pattern in human reasoning. If a small intervention produces a noticeable effect, it's natural to ask, what if the effect is bigger than we think? What if it extends further? But without careful measurement, that extension becomes speculation. There is currently no strong evidence that humming can reverse cellular aging, repair accumulated DNA damage, or restore biological systems to a younger state. Those processes involve mechanisms that are far more complex than anything influenced by simple mechanical vibration or short-term changes in breathing. Another important limitation is time. Aging unfolds over decades. To demonstrate reversal, you would need long-term, controlled observations showing that a specific intervention not only slows decline, but actually restores previous function at multiple levels. We don't have that. What we have are short-term studies, physiological measurements, and subjective reports. These are valuable, but they don't reach the scale required to support such a large conclusion. So a more precise way to interpret the idea is this. Humming may influence factors that are related to aging, such as stress levels, autonomic regulation, and possibly sleep quality. These factors can, over time, affect how the body maintains itself. But that is a very different statement from saying it reverses aging itself. And that distinction matters, because it separates what is physically plausible from what is currently unsupported. If you ignore that distinction, everything begins to blur. Small, measurable effects get inflated into sweeping claims. And once that happens, it becomes difficult to tell where observation ends and imagination begins. So the honest position is not that humming is useless, nor that it is a hidden key to youth. It is something in between. A simple action with real but limited effects, operating within a system whose deepest processes remain far more complex than the claim suggests. Now shift the focus from aging to the brain itself, because this is where the idea becomes more subtle and in some ways more plausible. The brain is not a fixed object. It is not like a machine assembled once and then left unchanged. Instead, it is continuously modifying its own structure. Connections between neurons strengthen, weaken, appear, and disappear depending on how they are used. This property is known as neuroplasticity. At any given moment, patterns of electrical activity are flowing through networks of neurons. When a particular pattern repeats, whether it's a thought, a movement, or a sensory experience, the connections supporting that pattern tend to become more efficient. Not dramatically, not instantly, but incrementally. A useful way to picture this is to imagine a large landscape covered in snow. The first time you walk across it, your footprints are shallow and quickly erased. But if you walk the same path repeatedly, the snow compresses and a visible trail forms. Over time, that path becomes the easiest route to follow. Neural pathways behave in a similar way. Repetition doesn't just express a pattern, it reinforces it. Now consider what humming actually involves. It is not just vibration. It is also attention, breath control, and a kind of sensory feedback loop. You produce a sound, you feel it in your body, and you adjust it, even if only slightly. That loop, action, sensation, adjustment, is exactly the kind of activity that can shape neural circuits over time. If humming consistently brings your system into a calmer, more regulated state, then repeating it could strengthen the neural pathways associated with that state. In other words, you may become better at entering and maintaining that condition, even outside of humming itself. But there's an important distinction to make. Rewiring the brain does not mean transforming it into something entirely new. It means shifting probabilities, making certain patterns more likely and others less so. For example, if a person is frequently anxious, their brain may be more practiced at entering high alert states. If they repeatedly engage in behaviors that promote calm regulation, they may gradually lower the threshold for those calmer states. Humming could be one such behavior, but it is not unique in that respect. Many activities, controlled breathing, rhythmic movement, focused attention, can produce similar effects. The brain does not respond to humming as a special category, it responds to patterns of input and repetition. Another layer to consider is timing. Short-term changes in brain activity can occur almost immediately. You might feel calmer after a few minutes of humming. But structural changes, actual modifications in connectivity, require consistent repetition over longer periods. And even then, the changes are usually subtle. They don't overwrite existing pathways, they coexist with them. The brain remains a complex system with multiple competing patterns. There is also the question of specificity. If humming does influence the brain, what exactly is being changed? Is it attention, emotional regulation, sensory processing? The answer is likely not a single function, but a combination of several overlapping systems. This makes the phenomenon difficult to isolate and measure. If you observe an improvement in mood or focus, it's not immediately clear which underlying mechanism is responsible. So the idea that humming rewires your brain contains a kernel of truth, but it needs to be interpreted carefully. Yes, repeated behaviors can shape neural pathways. Yes, humming is a repeatable behavior that influences both the body and attention. And yes, over time, this could contribute to small but meaningful shifts in how the brain operates. But these changes are not dramatic rewrites. They are gradual adjustments within an already dynamic system. The brain is always being rewired, whether you hum or not. The question is not whether change happens. It always does. The question is how much influence a specific action has within the vast network of influences acting on the system. And in that context, humming is best understood not as a powerful switch, but as one small, consistent input among many. Now the question becomes less about what humming does and more about why it is so difficult to pin down exactly what it does. At first, this seems strange. We can measure heart rate with precision. We can track electrical activity in the brain. We can analyze the chemical composition of blood down to tiny concentrations. With all of these tools, you might expect a clear, definitive answer. But the difficulty is not in the measurements themselves. It's in the system we're trying to understand. The human body is not a simple machine with isolated parts. It is a deeply interconnected network where changes in one place ripple outward in ways that are hard to predict. When you hum, multiple variables shift at the same time. Your breathing slows and becomes more regular. Muscles in your face and throat engage in a particular pattern. Your attention narrows slightly, often becoming more internal. Even your posture may adjust without you noticing. Each of these changes has its own effects. Breathing alone can influence heart rate and blood pressure. Attention can alter patterns of brain activity. Muscle engagement can affect sensory feedback signals. The problem is that all of these are happening simultaneously, so when you observe a result, say, a feeling of calm or a measurable shift in physiological markers, you're faced with a difficult question. Which part caused it? Was it the vibration itself, the slower breathing, the mental focus, or the interaction between all of them? This is what scientists refer to as a problem of confounding variables. In a controlled experiment, you try to isolate one factor at a time. But with something like humming, the factors are tightly coupled. You can't easily separate the sound from the breath, or the breath from the nervous system response. Another layer of complexity comes from individual variation. No two nervous systems are identical. Differences in anatomy, past experiences, and current physiological state all influence how a person responds. One individual might experience a noticeable shift in relaxation within seconds. Another might feel very little, even under the same conditions. These differences are not errors in the data. They are part of the reality being studied, but they make it much harder to draw universal conclusions. Then there is the issue of subjective experience. You can measure external indicators like heart rate or brain activity, but you cannot directly measure what it feels like to be inside someone else's mind. If a person reports that humming makes them feel calmer or more focused, that report is meaningful, but it is also inherently personal. Science tries to bridge this gap by combining subjective reports with objective measurements. But the connection is never perfect. A measurable change does not always correspond to a noticeable experience, and a strong experience does not always align with clear measurements. Time adds another complication. Many of the claims surrounding humming involve long-term effects. Changes in brain function, improvements in health, even influences on aging. But most experiments are short. They last minutes, hours, or at most a few weeks. From a scientific standpoint, that's a very small window. Long-term studies are difficult. They require sustained observation, consistent conditions, and large numbers of participants. Without that, it becomes nearly impossible to determine whether a small, short-term effect accumulates into something larger over years. There is also a more subtle issue: expectation. If a person believes that humming will relax them or improve their state, that belief can influence the outcome. This is not deception. It is a well-documented feature of how the brain works. Expectations can shape perception and even physiological responses. Separating the effect of the action itself from the effect of expectation is another challenge. So when you step back and look at the full picture, the uncertainty is not surprising. It's the natural result of studying a system that is complex, variable, and deeply interconnected. What we have are fragments of understanding, clear in isolation, but difficult to assemble into a single definitive explanation. And that leaves us in a position that is less satisfying but more accurate. We can describe what changes. We can measure parts of the process. But we cannot yet fully explain how all the pieces fit together or how far their influence extends. Now take all of these pieces, vibration, breathing, nervous system shifts, measurable chemical changes, and compress them into a single, careful statement that doesn't exaggerate what we know. Humming introduces a stable, low-frequency vibration into the body. It alters airflow, especially through the nasal passages, which can increase levels of nitric oxide locally. It naturally slows and regularizes breathing, often extending the exhalation phase. Through these changes, it appears to influence the balance of the autonomic nervous system, nudging it toward a state associated with reduced physiological arousal. At the same time, humming engages attention and creates a feedback loop between action and sensation. That loop, when repeated, can contribute to gradual adjustments in neural pathways through processes related to neuroplasticity. These adjustments are not dramatic rewrites, but small shifts in how easily certain states, like calm or steady focus, can be accessed. Individually, none of these effects are large. They are subtle, often temporary, and influenced by many other factors. But they are not isolated. They interact. And that interaction is where the more interesting possibility lies. Think of the body not as a collection of separate systems, but as a set of coupled processes. Breathing influences heart rhythm. Heart rhythm feeds back into brain activity. Brain activity shapes perception and emotional state. Each part is both cause and effect at the same time. In such a system, even small, consistent inputs can matter. Not because they are powerful in isolation, but because they are repeated within a network that is constantly adapting. Imagine a large crowd of people moving randomly in a plaza. If you push one person slightly, the effect is negligible. But if you introduce a steady rhythm, say a drum beat, and people begin to synchronize their movement to it, the overall pattern of the crowd can shift. Humming may act like a very small rhythmic input to the system. Not strong enough to dominate, but consistent enough to influence patterns over time. This perspective also clarifies what humming is not. It is not a direct tool for repairing damaged DNA. It does not selectively rebuild aging tissues. It does not override the fundamental biological constraints that govern how organisms change over time. Those processes operate at levels of complexity and scale that are far removed from simple mechanical vibration, but it may contribute to something more modest and more realistic. Improved regulation. Regulation is the ability of a system to maintain stability while adapting to changing conditions. In biological terms, this includes maintaining balanced heart rhythms, stable breathing patterns, and flexible but controlled neural activity. Many aspects of health, and by extension aspects of aging, are influenced by how well this regulation is maintained over long periods. If humming supports that regulation even slightly, then its effects could accumulate, not by reversing underlying processes, but by reducing the strain those processes are under. There is an important shift in thinking here. Instead of asking, does humming produce a large direct effect? The more useful question becomes, does it consistently bias the system in a particular direction? Small biases, applied repeatedly, can shape outcomes. This is true in physical systems, where tiny forces can alter trajectories over time. It is true in learning, where repeated exposure strengthens certain patterns. And it appears to be true in biological regulation as well. So the most grounded conclusion is not that humming transforms the body, but that it participates in the ongoing shaping of a system that is never static to begin with. It is one input among many, subtle, repeatable, and interacting with processes that are already in motion. And within that context, its significance is not absolute, but relational. Now step back from the details and look at the deeper question hiding underneath all of this. Why should something as small as a vibration, produced by your own voice, have any effect on your body at all? At first it feels surprising. You hum, and somehow your physiology shifts. But the surprise comes from how we usually think about ourselves. We tend to imagine the body as a solid object, stable and clearly defined, with processes happening inside it like components in a machine. That picture is useful, but it is incomplete. A more accurate description is that your body is a constantly changing pattern of interacting processes. Electrical signals move through neurons. Chemical reactions occur in every cell. Fluids flow. Structures flex and respond to forces. And underlying all of this is something more fundamental. Motion at the microscopic level. Nothing in your body is truly still. Molecules vibrate. Ions move across membranes. Proteins shift shape as they perform their functions. Even what feels like solid structure is, in physical terms, a dynamic arrangement of particles in motion. From that perspective, vibration is not something foreign that you introduce into the system. It is already there everywhere all the time. Humming doesn't create vibration, it organizes it. It takes a system that already contains countless overlapping, irregular fluctuations and adds a simple, repeating pattern. A steady frequency. A rhythm that persists for as long as you maintain it. In physics, systems often respond strongly to patterns that are regular and sustained. Random inputs tend to cancel out over time, but structured inputs can accumulate effects. This is related to the idea of resonance, where a system begins to respond more efficiently when it is driven at certain frequencies. But here's where things become less clear. The human body is not a single resonant system with one natural frequency. It is a collection of many interacting subsystems, each with its own properties. Some parts may respond to certain vibrations, while others do not. Some responses may amplify while others dampen. So when you hum, you are not tuning the body in a simple, predictable way. You are introducing a pattern into a complex environment, and the outcome depends on how that pattern interacts with everything else that is already happening. This is why the effects are subtle and variable. It also points to a deeper limitation in how we try to understand these phenomena. We often look for direct cause and effect relationships. One action produces one result. But in systems like the human body, causes and effects are distributed. They emerge from networks of interactions rather than from single, isolated mechanisms. Humming fits into that category. It is not a lever that controls a specific function. It is more like a background influence that slightly shifts the behavior of multiple processes at once. And this leads to a more general realization. What you experience as your state, your mood, your clarity, even your sense of physical well-being, is not fixed. It is the result of many small processes interacting continuously. Change any one of them even slightly, and the overall pattern can shift. Most of the time, these changes are too small to notice in isolation, but when they are repeated, they can accumulate. This is not unique to humming. It is a property of dynamic systems in general. A tiny, consistent input can alter the trajectory of a system over time, not by overwhelming it, but by continuously nudging it in a particular direction. So, the more interesting conclusion is not about humming itself. It is about how sensitive complex systems are to small structured influences. You are not a static object moving through time, gradually wearing down like a machine. You are a process, an ongoing self-organizing pattern. And processes do not just age. They evolve, adapt, and respond to the inputs they receive. Humming is one such input. Small, ordinary, and easy to overlook. But it reveals something larger, that even the simplest actions are part of a continuous interaction between structure, motion, and time. And once you see yourself in those terms, the question changes. It is no longer, can this one thing transform me? It becomes, what kinds of patterns am I repeatedly introducing into a system that never stops changing? At this point, it's worth turning the entire discussion around and looking at it from a different angle. Instead of asking what humming does to the body, ask what kind of system the body must be for something like humming to have any effect at all. If a system were rigid, perfectly stable, and resistant to change, then a small input like a gentle vibration would do essentially nothing. It would be absorbed and disappear without consequence. The fact that humming produces even subtle, measurable changes tells you something fundamental. The human body is highly sensitive to patterned input. This sensitivity is not a flaw. It is a requirement for survival. Your ability to adapt to temperature, respond to danger, learn from experience, and maintain internal balance all depend on being responsive to small signals. But that same responsiveness has an interesting consequence. It means there is no clear boundary between major influences and minor ones. The distinction is often a matter of scale and repetition, not category. Consider a simple physical analogy. If you push a heavy object once, it barely moves. But if you apply a small force continuously, the object will gradually accelerate. Over time, that small force can produce a large change in position. In physics, this is not surprising. It follows directly from the way motion works. In biological systems, the principle is similar, but harder to see because the movement is not always visible. It might be a shift in baseline stress levels, a change in how quickly you recover from disturbances, or a gradual adjustment in how neural pathways are weighted. Humming, in this context, is not important because it is powerful. It is important because it is repeatable. It is simple enough to be done frequently, stable enough to produce a consistent pattern, and mild enough that it doesn't disrupt the system in extreme ways. That combination, low intensity, high repeatability, is exactly the kind of input that can accumulate effects over time. But accumulation does not guarantee direction. This is another place where intuition can mislead. We often assume that repeating a behavior will push the system toward a clearly defined outcome. In reality, the direction of change depends on the context in which the behavior occurs. If humming consistently coincides with states of relaxation, then it may reinforce pathways associated with those states. If it is done in a distracted or irregular way, the effect may be negligible. The system responds not just to the action itself, but to the broader pattern in which the action is embedded. There is also the question of limits. No matter how often you hum, there are constraints imposed by biology. Cells age, systems degrade. The range within which the body can adapt is finite. Small inputs can shift behavior within that range, but they do not remove the boundaries. So the influence of humming, like any small intervention, exists within a larger framework of constraints and competing factors. This leads to a more grounded interpretation. Humming is one of many ways to introduce structured, repeatable input into a system that is constantly updating itself. Its effects are not isolated. They interact with everything else you do. How you sleep, how you move, how you think, and how your environment influences you. Seen this way, it stops being a special case. It becomes an example of how small, consistent patterns can participate in shaping a complex system, not by dominating it, but by contributing to its ongoing evolution. And that brings us to a final, more subtle shift in perspective. We often look for singular causes, one action that explains a large outcome. But systems like the human body don't work that way. Outcomes emerge from the interaction of many influences, each one small, each one incomplete. Humming does not stand outside that rule. It fits into it. It is one thread in a much larger fabric, where the overall pattern is determined not by any single strand, but by how all of them are woven together over time. Now we arrive at the point where the scientific explanation starts to dissolve into something more fundamental. Not mysticism, but limits. Every explanation we've built so far depends on a quiet assumption that we can separate cause from effect clearly enough to understand what is happening. But in complex systems like the human body, that separation is often artificial. When you hum, there is no single moment where one mechanism begins and another ends. There is only a continuous unfolding of interactions. Air moving, tissues vibrating, nerves responding, attention shifting, feedback loops adjusting in real time. If you try to freeze that process and isolate one piece, you lose something essential about what the system actually is. This is where physics itself offers an important lesson. In classical systems, like a falling object or a swinging pendulum, we can write clean equations that predict behavior with high accuracy. But even in physics, once systems become sufficiently complex, many interacting parts, feedback, adaptation, the neat separation between variables starts to break down. Biology sits exactly in that uncomfortable middle space. It is governed by physical laws, but it does not behave like simple mechanical systems. It is layered, adaptive, and context-dependent. The same input can produce different outcomes depending on timing, state, and history. So when we ask whether humming rewires the brain or reverses aging, we are really asking whether a small, structured pattern can meaningfully influence a system that is already saturated with countless overlapping patterns. The honest answer is, sometimes in limited ways, under specific conditions, but never in isolation. And that never in isolation is the key idea. Nothing in the body acts alone. Every process is embedded in a web of other processes. Breathing affects heart rhythm. Heart rhythm affects brain activity. Brain activity affects perception. Perception affects behavior. Behavior feeds back into all of it. Humming enters this web as a gentle, rhythmic perturbation. It does not override the system. It joins it. Now step back further. There is a deeper philosophical implication hiding inside this. We tend to think of ourselves as stable entities experiencing change. But from a biological and physical perspective, it may be more accurate to say we are change itself. Temporary patterns of organization maintained over time by continuous processes. In that view, aging is not a single pathway moving in one direction. It is the gradual shift in how those processes maintain themselves under constraints. Energy limits, molecular damage, environmental stress, and time. And humming, like many small behaviors, is part of how those processes are regulated moment to moment, not as a solution to aging, not as a tool that reaches into the deepest layers of biology and reverses them, but as one small way the system influences its own internal dynamics. This distinction matters because it removes the illusion of control without removing the reality of influence. You are not separate from the processes that shape you. You are the ongoing result of them. Every breath, every sound, every repeated action is part of the structure that is being continuously rebuilt. So the question is not whether humming is powerful enough to transform the body. The question is more precise. How do small, repeatable patterns participate in the continuous reconstruction of a system that never stays the same for long? And once you frame it that way, humming stops being an isolated phenomenon to explain. It becomes a reminder. A reminder that what we call you is not a fixed object slowly wearing down, but a dynamic arrangement of processes that are always responding, always adjusting, always in motion. From that perspective, the deepest conclusion is not about humming at all. It is about understanding that stability is not the absence of change. It is the outcome of change that is carefully balanced, moment by moment, across a system too complex to ever fully reduce into simple explanations. And in that sense, the mystery is not something to be solved. It is something you are already participating in, continuously, whether you notice it or not.